So the 15th Amendment was the final one of the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment gave ended slavery. The 14th Amendment gave all people rights to life, liberty, and property, which would be recognized by the federal government. And if the state governments did not recognize the right to trial, the right to marry, the right to own property of all people within its states, this would trigger the latent power of the federal government, who would come in and intervene and ensure that all Americans shared the same basic privileges and rights. And then the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed all men the right to vote. Now, these so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they supported a newly empowered national state and represent nothing short of a constitutional revolution. If you think of the first 10 amendments, those amendments were about limiting the power of the federal government. What the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment does is to empower the federal government to protect the rights of individual Americans. This isn't about face, right? The government had always been seen as, having the greatest potential for tyranny. That Americans had to be watchful of a government that could become too powerful. Hence, the first 10 amendments, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., were about protecting the rights of American individuals from the government. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are different because they use the power of the federal government to protect American people from each other. So what these amendments do is to guarantee these basic American rights to all people. And if the states abridge those rights, the federal government is going to step in and ensure that all Americans have these rights. And they also imply that the U.S. government could use military power to enforce federally sanctioned rights. I mean, think about 1955 and the desegregation of the Little Rock schools in Arkansas. Because Brown versus Board of Education found that black... Excuse me. Because Brown versus Board of Education found that black children in the South, and nationwide, in fact, were not receiving the same education as everybody else, they said that their rights were not equal. So what they did was they used the power of the federal government to desegregate the schools. When Arkansas, for instance, refused to desegregate the school, Eisenhower sent in federal troops. Right? So what these amendments do is not only do they create a more equitable situation and protect the rights of all Americans, they also imply that the power of the federal government will be used to enforce these rights if, in fact, the states try and strip people of their rights. And, of course, this is a major change. Now, the 14th and 15th Amendments, of course, did not end all discrimination. You could even argue that the prison labor system, which emerges in the South in the late 1800s, kind of gave lie to the 13th Amendment. But the truth of it is that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement, which would come, alas, about 90 years later. Nevertheless, had these amendments not been in place, the task would have been much more difficult. The problem is getting the federal government to actually back up these rights that had been guaranteed to the newly freed African American people. Now, interestingly, one place where the federal government did intervene was through the so-called Enforcement Acts, and this was about trying to combat the Ku Klux Klan. Republicans in the North, admittedly, they are starting to retreat from the more idealistic aspirations of Reconstruction, and people like Ulysses S. Grant did promote reunification as the most important goal of Reconstruction rather than reform of the South. But nevertheless, they saw the Ku Klux Klan as a major problem, not only because of the violence that they visited upon the South, but also because that violence was political. The Ku Klux Klan was tampering in elections in an effort to try and prevent Republicans from voting. So what Ulysses S. Grant does is he passes the so-called Force Acts. This is a series of 3 acts which are intended to run the Ku Klux Klan and other conspiratorial white supremacist paramilitary groups in the South out of business, by basically saying that they are acting in outright rebellion and treason against the United States. And the Ku Klux Klan Act, one of the force acts which followed in 1871, allowed the Army to intervene and the suspension of habeas corpus for any suspected terrorists of the Ku Klux Klan. It made tampering with the vote a federal crime, so Ku Klux Klan night riders who would go up to African American or Republican households and threaten them if they voted, that was now considered a federal crime. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested and many fled. In some places, the Ku Klux Klan threatened to rebel, but largely most Southerners kind of hung up their hats, their pointy hats, and put their bed sheets back on the bed where it belongs, and stopped marching with the Ku Klux Klan. This really wasn't, even though the government had threatened mass trials and to imprison anyone who participated in the Ku Klux Klan, that really wasn't the purpose of the bill. The bill was intended to run the Ku Klux Klan out of business, which, by the way, it largely did. And now, of course, you say, well, there's still a Ku Klux Klan today. Where did it come from? The Ku Klux Klan is reformed in 1920s America, mostly from sort of borrowing from the playbook of the original Ku Klux Klan during the Reconstruction era. There was a movie put out by D.W. Griffith that was called Birth of a Nation, which subscribed to this romantic idea of the South where the Ku Klux Klan, and this is racist stuff, okay, but where the Ku Klux Klan was seen as white knights protecting white women in the South from black quote-unquote beasts, as they were referred to in the movie. And of course, these newly elected black state legislatures in the 1870s were also ripe for ridicule in Birth of a Nation. And ultimately, Birth of a Nation is very influential. It's based on a book by Thomas Dixon called The Klansman, so I guess they should get quote-unquote credit for that as well. But this romantic image of the Ku Klux Klan as defending a fallen South, which is being occupied by Union forces, Republicans, and where black folks are supposedly allowed to run rampant and, of course, threaten the virtue of white women. This leads to a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. But largely, the force acts under Ulysses S. Grant ran the Ku Klux Klan out of business. Most were not convicted, as the Ku Klux Klan Act was about trying to drive a criminal conspiracy out of business, not incarcerate hundreds of people. But largely, the act succeeded, and they went out of business. The Ku Klux Klan went out of existence largely by 1872, only to be revived in the 1920s. But nevertheless, because of the force acts, the 1872 elections were probably the most democratic and the fairest in the South that they would see until 1968, after the passage of the 1965 Voter Rights Act.